Awesome. All right, Irina, are you ready to, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Irina Meza. As Chelsea mentioned, I'm the Chief of Staff here at Mission Capital. And so we started planning this member meetup as centering equity in HR, centering equity on your team. But as recent events have unfolded, we actually decided to pivot. And so Chelsea and I are going to be actually presenting together this member meetup on centering equity. So the first thing we wanted to start with, before we get into any of the material we prepared today, is we wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the current events that are happening, from the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and Breonna Taylor, to Christian Cooper's experience with racism while bird watching. We know that these events are all related to systemic, institutional, interpersonal, and individual racism. And we also know that there are a number of people we don't know about whose stories are not being covered by media outlets. We couldn't start any discussion about centering equity without acknowledging what's going on, and that action and change are long overdue. And while we aren't going to claim to have the answers, and we're not going to be able to provide you with next steps, we are internally continuing to find ways to address systemic and institutional racism within our own organization and how we break down white supremacy culture. Our hope is that our gathering today will serve as shared resources and supports for each other. But with that said, we'd like to start with a moment of silence for Ahmaud, George, Breonna, and countless other Black people that have been murdered because of racist acts. May they rest in power. Thank you so much for sharing in that moment of silence with us. And so we wanted to get started today by sharing this picture with you from Move to End Violence about the productivity paradox. Move to End Violence is an organization that focuses on building movement for social change. And so we are going to share out the entire deck in the chat so that you can have access to it. But one of the things that they highlight in the productivity paradox is this need to be productive. And specifically for organizational leadership, our need to get things done for our people, to mobilize resources for our work, and respond strategically to political opportunities. But the question they ask is that what's really needed during this time? And is that what this moment is calling for? And so this picture really highlights what productivity looks like when it's rooted in fear. And so on the left-hand side of the picture, we see a woman who's carrying this 1-ton weight, and it's rooted in fear, and she's powering over. She has a need to control or have it together, having all of the answers, and then feeling like a fraud. And then you move through the picture, and then you see another woman who's working productivity on purpose. She's purposefully working, and she's ensuring moments of connection, standing up for people, making sure that that there are practices that support balance, surrendering that perfection, acknowledging all of us are experiencing collective trauma and grief, and extending grace to ourselves and to others. And so for me, this picture really highlights the difference between working in fear, productively working in fear, versus working on purpose. And those traps that we can fall into when we're just moving through, trying to be productive and not taking time to really create space. Because as this picture highlights, this really is an opportunity. It's a breakthrough moment for us as leaders to become who we want to become. And so we'd like for you to share in the chat box some of the thoughts that come up for you as you see this picture. Grace. Trying to be a savior of the organization. Openness. We don't have to have all the answers. Yep. Carrying the load for decades, people of color. Connection. Inequality. Focusing on empowerment. Grief and collective trauma. Figuring out how to move out of survival mode. Yes. Old ways versus innovation. Thinking versus thriving versus surviving. Yes. So I think that leads us into our next discussion about self-regulation.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm super grateful for is that this year, a few of us from Mission Capital were able to be a part of a book study. It was led by Fatima Mann of the Community Advocacy and Healing Project. If you haven't read My Grandmother's Hands, I'm a huge book nerd. If you don't know anything about me, I was like, ooh, a book study, I'm so in, by Resma Menakem. And I will say we learned so much in the 6 months that we read a section at a time and had discussions. If you ever have the opportunity to work with Fatima, I cannot tell you how much of a joy and a learning amount that you will have. But one of the things that has really stuck with us and that we've seen be really resonant in our work, and that's something that really came back with us to our day-to-day in the office, and especially now in our virtual office, is the concept of settling the body. Resma says that a calm, settled body is the foundation for health, for healing, for helping others, and for changing the world. And I think there's a lot in here that really resonates about, especially as we think through what we're dealing with and what we're taking care of. I think the biggest reminder is that at the core of it, we're human bodies living in a controlled by our biology. We have things that will come up for us. And so they recommend a lot of self-regulation strategies for engaging, for doing really any work. Really, but specifically, especially as we're navigating these times, to remember that there are some self-regulation strategies that will help settle the body and make sure that we're building up our strength and our stamina as we approach this work. So just a couple reminders, and some of our favorite ones are on the screen. Irina, do you want to share a few of the techniques that we've used?
Yeah, so we've really been focusing on self-regulation strategies with our team at Mission Capital. And some of the ways we've also offered are ways to self-regulate yourself so no one else knows, or if you're in a public space and you don't want someone to know. I like to regularly rotate my ankle, although staff probably know that because they see me doing it all the time now. Another one that we've shared are a couple of pressure points. There is a Union Valley point that is right between your thumb and your index finger. If you press that pressure point, you can just hold there for a few seconds and press. You can massage also. And we've also shared with staff the inner frontier gate point, which is about 3 fingers below your wrist. If you press right there as well, or you massage there, that's also another way for you to self-regulate. We often joke that sometimes we're going to rock in unison in meetings, or we're going to sing in unison in meetings. But if you can't do that, those are some that you can do that are a little hidden as well. And we will share a link to the pressure points in the chat box also, so that you have access to those. I think for us, the thing that has been really important is just stressing the importance of having multiple ways to self-regulate and practicing them regularly. Because when you're in the moment or you're having a conversation, sometimes if you haven't practiced them, it's easy to not be able to find yourself in that moment. But if you continually practice them, then you'll find yourself doing them automatically without even realizing that you're self-soothing yourself.
Yeah, one of my favorites is hand on the chest. And so it looks like I'm just really connecting with myself, but it's been an awesome pressure point, and just a way to kind of take myself back into like, what is it? I think the image that called out, what is our purpose? And that's a good reminder to like take a step back and like, what am I trying? What's my purpose part? Awesome.
So we wanted to move into some ways to center equity.
So we're going to kind of talk about each of these points and how they kind of manifest in the workplace. Although, I mean, obviously we think they're great strategies for all sorts of different occasions. The first one is really related to what we were just talking about with self-regulation. Self-regulation is a tool to really practice your own self-care, to have the stamina to continue to do the work. As a Native American, but also somebody who has access to extreme white body privilege, I think it's really important to think about how this is resonant for both white folks and people of color. Especially as people who have white body privilege, the building of the racial stamina is key to make sure that you're engaged and can show up and do the work. When you're managing your own emotions, when you're asking other people to manage your emotions for you, and bringing that into a space, you're detracting from the work, the conversations that need to be had, the discussions that need to take place in the work that needs to be done. So I love to remember that it's really incumbent on us to come ready, prepared and centered and feeling like we can engage and have difficult conversations. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me as a Latina, I know it's important to self-care because racism and microaggressions are exhausting. And I know I have to continue to fill my cup to stay in the work and sometimes just to make it through the day. But I also recognize that as a non-Black person of color, that I also have ingrained messages of whiteness, and I have to continue to develop my racial stamina to confront my own biases and be able to stand in solidarity with my Black brothers and sisters and Indigenous and Native brothers and sisters and not center myself. So it's really important for me to remember to self-care and to continue to develop my own racial stamina. And so we also wanted to highlight the importance of empowering your staff to maintain their wellness and develop self-care strategies. And it's really important for you, if you're in a position of leadership in your organization, that you're not just telling your staff to maintain their wellness and develop strategies, but that you're modeling this behavior as well. It's really one thing for you to tell staff to create work-life balance, but then to send implicit or very explicit messages about how much you're working and that you're not self-caring for yourself. And so it's really important to make sure you're checking in with your staff to make sure that they are self-caring. And while this is really different for everyone, when you have staff, who are not taking breaks or who are not taking lunch, that you as a leader not only model that behavior, but that you normalize that it is okay for them to take lunch and take breaks, and make sure that staff are taking that time to fill their own cups. There have been times that I've blocked out on my calendar that I'm participating in a YWCA dialogue or courageous conversation dialogue, and I'm sending that message implicitly that staff can do this too, but you also need to send that message explicitly as well, and make sure that you're telling them that it's okay for them to find that space also during the workday to be able to fill their cup too. So one of the things that we like to do is we like to regularly send out opportunities for staff to participate in. So for instance, last week, there was an online conversation that was open to anyone with Dr. Ibram Kendi. So I sent out the link to staff, letting them know that it was available, but we also had an MC meeting at the same time. So not only did I send out the link, but then I also bumped the meeting to end or to start after Dr. Ibram Kendi's presentation finished, so that staff got a very clear message that if you want to go participate in this online conversation or dialogue with Dr. Kendi, that's completely fine. We moved our meeting back so that staff got that explicit message as well. And so those small things really do make a difference. So it's one, making sure you're self-caring, two, making sure that your staff are doing this and that you're modeling and you're sending the messages that you want to send.
Yeah, I think we cannot overemphasize how much our actions really speak, even if it's something that's said, but it's not something that's modeled or it's not something that's done. It sends different conflicting messages. Yeah, the next one is really being aware of the digital divide and supporting your employees in multiple ways as you work remotely. I had the opportunity to be in a really good discussion hosted by the Teach for America for Austin alumni chapter, where Carl Settles from E4 Youth and IUPRA, researchers from the IUPRA at University of Texas, we're talking about the digital divide that we were seeing in the education system. And it's pervasive and it's intense, and the things that are happening in Austin, we are in a very disconnected reality, right? But what has sat with me is how much that doesn't change just because we graduate, right? The realities exist and permeate. And so all the challenges they were bringing up there are absolutely challenges that my peers and my colleagues and myself are struggling with in different ways as well.
Yeah, and so we also realize the privilege that we have at Mission Capital to be able to allow our staff and to be able to work remotely. But we also know that we have to think about what that means for our staff also when it comes to equity. In the HR blog we posted about centering equity, I cited an article from Fastly Inc. that highlighted that most low-income folks do not have the necessary internet speeds or bandwidth to be able to do their work or to participate in school. And so those are other things that we want to also think about, that just because we gave our staff a laptop or they have a computer monitor, or they have access to online tools like Zoom or Teams, that we also have to make sure that they have the other things that they need to do their job as well. And so you can do this by offering stipends if you're able to, but if you're not, just have conversations with your staff and find out what they need, and really just try to make sure that you're opening those lines of connection and communication so staff know that you're considering those things and trying to figure out how to make sure that they are successful, not only because you want them to do the work, but you want them to stay connected and be part and belong to the organization as well. And so you also want to think about Zoom. Does every meeting have to be a video meeting? Is that something that we want to do? We don't know what staff's living situations may be at times. And so is it fair for us to have them open up their space to us at all times also? So those are just some other things that we want to be thinking about, but make sure to include your staff in those decisions and be inclusive of their voice as well. We also wanted to make sure to highlight that it's really important to acknowledge current events and opening space for conversation. And so we've been working at Mission Capital on equity for almost 2 years, but we're still on our journey. We don't have all the answers. We make mistakes, but we know we need to acknowledge current events and find ways to create space to open conversation. But that doesn't mean that we have to be the ones leading those conversations. We're always trying to find resources that we can point our staff to. And it's okay for you to do that also. If you can't lead those conversations, that's fine. But if you have an employee assistance program that you can direct your staff to, or if there are community resources that you know about, we talked about YWCA. I know that Chelsea shared some resources already about building racial stamina, Courageous Conversations Online. They have regular bi-weekly conversations that we'll share with you also. The whole point is to make sure that you're acknowledging and creating space for staff. And even if staff just want to come together and talk amongst each other, that's okay too. We just need to normalize that it's okay for us to work together and to share and have those conversations. And so we'd also like to take a moment to offer you an opportunity to share any resources that you have in the chat box that we can also share amongst each other.
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot of suggestions like the Diversity Gap podcast, the Code Switching podcast. Liberating Structures is a great one. Absolutely. Someone's using Microsoft Teams as a tool to allow people to share topics, resources, and celebrate personal and professional achievements. The Therapy for Black Girls podcast. Yeah, I think a lot of times when we're doing our work and then we can be really heads down and it can feel really heavy, and remembering that it's not just our work, it's a collective work. And it's not just our organization, there's lots of people working. These connections can be really huge.
And so we also wanted to share this quote with you from Audre Lorde. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And I pulled this quote from the Audre Lorde Project, and I want to share what it says on the Audre Lorde Project. It talks about, in moments of grief, crisis, or trauma, and the time before or after, we need each other to survive and thrive. We're obliged to lift up, honor, and hold space for our self-determination, to fight for our lives, and to remind each other of our worth and that none of us are disposable. And so they also offer a template for wellness planning that we will share with you as well so that you can access. But again, for us, it's so important just to remind our staff, and we're hoping that's a takeaway for you, is self-care, self-regulation as we move through not only the pandemic, but all of the current events that are happening right now. And so we did also want to create some space for breakout groups so that everyone had an opportunity to connect and share as well. And so we're going to be moving into breakout groups next. And so what we're asking is if you'll share, when you're thinking about centering equity in your workplace, what's working, what's not working. And we'll be in there for
10 minutes.
10 minutes, and then we'll also have an opportunity to share out when we come back.